Now, from Tony Blair at Fettes to Boris Johnson and David Cameron at Eton, the path from Britain's boarding schools to the highest echelons of government is well trodden. But are these elite establishments producing bad leaders? That's the view of the psychotherapist Nick Duffell, whose book Wounded Leaders argues they give rise to bullying and betrayal. Earlier, I caught up with him in Edinburgh and started by asking him what he thought the problem was with boarding schools.
A boarding child has to grow up without parents, without family, without different generations, without people down the street, without all the kind of normal things in life. And this can start very early. In Britain, our custom's been to send children away at 7 or 8. That's very normal, but even younger sometimes. Our Prime Minister went away at 7, for example. And what it does, it means that the child has to adapt to that situation on its own. They adapt by cutting off from their feelings, by often not trusting people, and developing what I call the strategic survival personality, which is a kind of defensive personality, always on the lookout for safety, for not getting into trouble. And then they have to reason. The most difficult thing is they have to reason, well, what's the matter with me? Why did my parents, why did they send me away? They say they love me, but they sent me away. So this sets up a very difficult internal psychological state in the child.
Your focus is on wounded leaders. How destabilising is it for this country, the United Kingdom, to have these leaders from, as you put it, these broken beginnings?
Well, you see, I've been pioneering psychotherapy with what I call boarding school survivors for 25 years, and I've known all along that there's been a political ramification, and it means in the kind of politics that we have today, they can't make relationships like Angela Merkel has done or Obama has tried to do. Cameron wants to dominate, wants to lead, but actually people in Europe say you have to join first. Now here's a psychological thing that's a bit complex, is actually boarding school survivors hadn't have enough of belonging at home. So it's joining things, belonging is a very fraught area for them.
Now, you point out yourself that psychologists warn of making national generalisations. Some people might say that you're offering a left-leaning critique of privileged people such as David Cameron and Boris Johnson.
That's one way you could take it, but you see, I've spent a lifetime thinking about this, and one of the things you have to ask yourself, why is it only Britain that has these schools, Britain or our ex-colonies? It's something very specific, and does that fit to the fact that in Britain the structured class system is still very, very unusual from a European perspective, for example, and it is. And has it anything to do with the fact that we haven't really made a proper social democracy here in Britain in the way that European countries have?
What about the other side of the political spectrum? Tony Blair, educated in the city at Fettes. How would you compare him to David Cameron, his attributes, his behaviour?
I think Tony Blair, in some ways, even more dangerous because he was very sophisticated, very good talker. What we had to realise with Blair that he was going to, in some ways, betray his supporters consistently for the sake of being right next to power. Actually, what I call that is the old boy, that's the head boy syndrome. Blair was the head boy. Steve Bell said he was Bush's poodle, but no, he was the head boy. And so I think he's a very complex and very, very dangerous politician for me.
So those are the old boys who've been to boarding school. Yeah. What about the prime ministers who haven't been? Gordon Brown went to Kirkcaldy High School, Margaret Thatcher went to Grantham School for Girls. Tony Blair alluded to Gordon Brown's psychological flaws, and well, Margaret Thatcher's character has been extensively criticised too.
Oh, everyone's a human being. I'm not saying that only the only problem is the boarding school. But the thing is, in this top-down society, everyone tries to model themselves on actually this characteristic, and fundamental to that way of being is the difficulty with your own vulnerability. Now that means if you can't really deal at all with your own vulnerability, you cannot actually have an empathic response to the vulnerability of others. And I think that's something that most of us, and certainly here in Scotland, we've actually had enough of, but we haven't really been able to name it properly yet.
So, Nick, what's the answer? How do we change this professional cadre of leadership that we seem to have grown in the United Kingdom?
So we're saying, actually, we want to stop boarding for young children, and when we take that all the way up to 16, but certainly under 13, we want to stop it. And we would like to make then the facilities of boarding schools more democratic. You know, that it's only those who can afford 30,000 can get these facilities, because this will actually help the whole system. Because now it's so polarised between state schools, certainly in England, between state schools and the private sector.
So, in a nutshell, you're calling for an end to the current system of boarding schools?
I think it has to change. I think we have to change it radically. We have to understand that actually we are not any longer in the 1890s. We're in a situation where actually mothers, for example, count, and if you know, we've got this boarding habit in Britain, and we don't have one single theory of child development that supports it.
Finally, there's not such a boarding school culture in Scotland, but there are independent state schools, and pupils who've been there are able to exude confidence. How can state school pupils manage to exude that same level of confidence?
Well, I'm not sure that it's possible just to do that, because actually, for me, it's a false defensive confidence. It works up to a point, but then from a certain level, it's actually rather dangerous.
Nick Duffell, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, joining me now to look at today's news is comedian Bruce Fumey and Alison Rowett from the Herald. Good evening to both of you. Thanks very much for joining me. First of all, let's pick up on what Nick was saying there. Very interesting thesis. Bruce, what did you make of it?
Well, it struck me that, first of all, you've got a lot of Tory leaders that promote family values and so on and so forth, and they themselves haven't grown up in the middle of a family, right? Which begs the question, what's going on in their heads? And the other thing that struck me was, why aren't there more islanders who are sent away to boarding schools for secondary schools in government, yeah? And more to the point, I can understand how these driven people try to get into positions in business or whatever, but ultimately, if we live in a democracy, these guys have to go through selection at constituency level, and then before they ever get to be Prime Minister or whatever, ultimately, somewhere along the line, the public have voted for them. So there's a bigger question about the psyche of people in Britain that are voting for these people rather than their own psychological problems.
And Alison, I think Nick was saying that we're also conditioned, we're also used to leaders being like that. But I was pointing out to him that Gordon Brown and Margaret Thatcher, two other well-known leaders, have not been to boarding school, and yet, of course, their psychological character has been well examined.
Quite, and it would have been fascinating to know more about what you thought about the Scottish Parliament, because we always think that's a little more meritocratic, you know, it doesn't have so many people that have gone to private schools, but there's still even there a dominance of the traditional professions, you know, the old families, that kind of thing.
And Bruce, as I was saying there, there's not such a huge boarding school tradition in Scotland. There is the independent, strong independent sector, and those kids often can exude that kind of confidence. How can, as I was asking Nick there, how can state school children have that same level of confidence that they can meet an employer with that strong level of confidence?
Well, you can never prepare kids in a state school in the way that they're prepared in a public school. And for a kicker, if your parents have got enough money to send you to a public school, that in itself gives you a level of confidence to deal with the world that if you're brought up in a housing scheme in East End of Glasgow, you're never going to have. Yeah.
And Alison, Bruce was saying, well, it's hollow confidence. Sorry, Nick was saying it's hollow confidence. It doesn't mean anything. But if you're sitting there in a job interview, that confidence does impress.
It does mean a lot. You know, it means that you're able to speak in public. You're able to feel that you're holding your own in company. It gives them an enormous advantage.